Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys about a very beneficial tool that I think some people can use, and it's something I'm using in my own conjugate training for my max work right now, and that is utilizing deficit deadlifts of various height for progressive range of motion for improving your deadlift. And I'm going to get into in a minute specifically why this works on the deadlift. And not necessarily for every person. Some people are not built to do deficit deadlifts, particularly people with really short arms and maybe longer legs versus arm ratios. Not always good. But if you have longer arms like me, this is a fantastic, absolutely fantastic way to build up your deadlift. So progressive range of motion is something you do see talked about, and it's not a method that I personally buy into. What I will point out with people is that just because there have been some very strong individuals in the past who have successfully utilized it as part of their training, not as their primary method of training, doesn't mean that a tool is particularly effective, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's the best tool available for the job. In other words, yes, there have been some very strong people who've used partials. There have been people who've even included doing partial work that is heavier than their max and starting with a partial rep and then adding an inch every week until they get it to a full range of motion. However, what you need to remember is that these are people who usually have an enormous strength base, and these are people who are still usually doing full range of motion training, and they're not increasing that much. In other words, it's not like the person is standing there and like the example has been done with the overhead press. It's not like someone has ever taken a 200-pound overhead press and done lockout work with 275 who had a 200 max and then works the 275 down to where they can do 275. It doesn't work that way. All right, it's usually stuff like they have a 200 pound, so they'll try a 210 or a 215 lockout and they've worked it down, while hopefully still continuing to do full range of motion work. And there are exercises that can benefit from certain sorts of partials as a motor unit learning tool. All right, there are exercises that do that, but they don't work if you do partials at random ranges of motion. Right? They work if you do certain things as far as sticking points go, and then you do that to train your bar path. Like the squat and the overhead press are both examples that there's going to be one specific spot, and if you deviate from that partial more than 1 inch either direction, it doesn't give you what you're looking for. That train you to find an ideal bar path. Right? They're about training a bar path. They're not about actually getting stronger in terms of increasing muscle mass or neuromuscular efficiency. They're a training tool. But when it comes to the deadlift, we're dealing with the opposite problem, aren't we? The deadlift is not entirely a full range of motion exercise. The fact that we can do deficit deadlifts at all, like for me in some of these, I'm doing over a 3-inch deficit. If you think between the boots and the red plate, what are we doing? I mean, if you can add over 3 inches to a range of motion of an exercise with something like that, you're obviously dealing with a partial. Now, the deadlift is not an extreme partial, right? Most of the joints are going beyond 50% of their possible range of motion, but they're nowhere near their full range of motion, right? Hips, knees, any of that stuff. But a lot of them are going through a pretty good range of motion. Well, not necessarily the knees. So when we increase range of motion on the deadlift, we are turning it into a full range of motion exercise. Again, at least for some of the muscles involved, some of the joints involved. So if you take an exercise like the deadlift, that's one of the biggest complaints against it, is that because it's a heavy exercise that is a partial that lets you lift more weight due to leverages, and it places a large amount of axial loading on the spine, you can have recovery issues on the deadlift. In other words, limit sets and maxes on the deadlift have enormous problems with recovery. So the amount of fatigue that you generate versus the training effect on the deadlift isn't always particularly good. Again, it's a subject of great controversy. But what happens when we start doing this with deficit deadlifts? Well, you look at a lot of people out there. Dr. Mike Israel, perfect example, says, hey, the deficit deadlift or the snatch grip deadlift are fantastic hypertrophy exercises compared to the normal deadlift, because we can get a larger training effect with a slightly lighter weight by increasing the range of motion. Therefore, we can do more workload and get a greater training stimulus versus the amount of fatigue they generate. But doesn't that carry over to the max also? That's the interesting thing. A deadlift uses the same bar path as a normal conventional deadlift. In other words, you take 2 inches out of the range of motion, you're actually just adding 2 inches to the hardest part of the exercise. Well, what is it people have historically found with the deadlift is that if they are stuck at the bottom, and that's usually where you stick, it's the hardest off the bottom for most people most of the time. And I guarantee you, no matter how strong you are on the deadlift, you're going to reach a point where the very bottom will become your sticking point. It will become your sticking point. So by having to work the hardest part more by increasing the range of motion, we make the exercise more difficult. And if you get stronger at a deficit deadlift and you've been stuck on the floor, what usually happens? Your max goes up. Your max goes up. So this is something that we can do with progressive range of motion on the deadlift. And in my case, I'm utilizing it for my max effort work, right? I'm using varying plate heights that are very small differences, a half inch here, an inch there, on different days to bypass the law of accommodation. But I'm also trying to get stronger at each deficit. In other words, in an ideal world, if I can pull a certain amount off of a 1-inch deficit, I eventually want to be able to pull it off of a 2-inch deficit, eventually pull it off of a 3-inch deficit. And if I can pull a lift off of a 3-inch deficit, my max will go up, right? In other words, if I can get to where I can take my old max and I can pull it from a 3-inch deficit, my 1 rep max is going to go up significantly. And that even applies to the hook grip. A lot of people aren't aware of that range of motion matters on a grip on a deadlift. When you go to a deficit deadlift, your grip can actually become a problem even with the same weights because you're pulling it through a longer distance. And pulling it through that distance is hard. It's sometimes easier to hold a weight at the very top than it is to keep pulling it while it's in motion. And it has to do with force generation. It has to do with pulling force over time against having to grip. Once it's stationary and you're no longer moving at the top, it isn't as difficult on your grip as actually moving the weight because, again, that force being applied to the hands. So that longer range of motion also becomes grip training, doesn't it? And that's something people don't think about when they start looking at heavy partials for grip. That's one reason that people use them as a grip tool, right? That's one reason the above-the-knee rack lockout is used as a grip tool, because you can grip a heavier weight, even without straps, right? And it's used then as a grip training tool just to get used to holding that heavier weight at the top without having to pull that heavier weight through the full distance. But the deficit deadlift also in that regard becomes a grip training tool, not just a range of motion training tool for that reason, because that longer stroke on the pull can work for grip. But the point we get to is that we're adjusting a variable. Just like we can change weight on an exercise to increase the tension, increasing the range of motion, particularly through the hardest part of the exercise, also increases tension. In terms of a training effect, in a lot of ways, that has a similar training effect to increasing the weight. But when you take an exercise like the deadlift that has so much axial loading, it doesn't cause as much fatigue as increasing the weight. Well, what does that mean? That means we can get a larger training response without necessarily more fatigue that's going to create a problem. So what I'm suggesting is that using a progressive range of motion with similar weights can pay huge dividends. So let's say you're stuck at a 450 deadlift off the floor, right? That's the heaviest you can pull, and you can't seem to get to 455 or 460. Start doing deficit work, right? Work on maybe pulling just a little bit less. Work on getting to where you can pull 5 pounds under that 445 from a 1-inch deficit. Then try to do it from a 2-inch deficit, then a 3-inch deficit. And if you can do that, what you will generally find is that even if you can take 5 pounds less than your max and bring it down to where you can pull it from a 2.5-inch or a 3-inch deficit, your max is going to go up. And all of a sudden, your 450 deadlift that was stuck at 455 or 460, you couldn't lift those. All of a sudden, you're going to find you can pull the 460. You might even magically find you can pull the 470. I know that for me, messing with deficits like that at one time, the best I ever got was like a 50-pound increase on my deadlift. inside of a couple of months. So I have done it before that way, and it works. It's a valuable tool. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.